A region synonymous with volatility, the Middle East finds itself once again at the epicenter of global concern. The long-simmering Israeli-Palestinian conflict, dormant yet never truly resolved, erupted with a ferocity unseen in recent years. What began as a series of escalating clashes in 2023 rapidly morphed into a multi-front conflict in 2024, engulfing the region in a maelstrom of violence and uncertainty. The year 2023 witnessed a steady deterioration of the fragile peace, punctuated by political upheaval in Israel, a resurgence of violence in Gaza and the West Bank, and the menacing shadow of Hezbollah's growing involvement. By 2024, the situation had reached a boiling point, with full-scale military operations, international intervention, and a burgeoning humanitarian crisis. The world watches with bated breath, apprehensive of a wider conflagration that could have far-reaching global consequences. The conflict, however, is not merely a contemporary crisis. It is deeply rooted in a century-old struggle, a complex tapestry woven with historical grievances, political machinations, and unfulfilled aspirations. To comprehend the current situation, one must delve into the historical quagmire that continues to shape the present. The roots of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict can be traced back to the early 20th century, a period marked by rising nationalism, competing territorial claims, and the waning influence of the Ottoman Empire. This era saw the emergence of both Arab and Jewish nationalist movements, each with their own aspirations and visions for the future of the region. The Balfour Declaration of 1917, a pivotal moment in the conflict's history, sowed the seeds of discord by pledging British support for a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine, a land already inhabited by a significant Arab population. This declaration was seen by many Arabs as a betrayal, leading to deep-seated resentment and opposition. The ensuing decades witnessed waves of Jewish immigration to Palestine, escalating tensions with the indigenous Arab population. These tensions often erupted into violent clashes as both communities vied for control and recognition in a land they both claimed as their own. The 1948 Arab-Israeli War resulted in Israel's victory and the displacement of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, creating a refugee crisis that continues to reverberate today. This war marked the beginning of a protracted and bitter struggle with lasting impacts on the regional and global stage. Subsequent conflicts in 1967 and 1973 further entrenched Israel's military dominance while exacerbating Palestinian grievances. These wars not only reshaped the geopolitical landscape, but also deepened the animosities and mistrust between the two sides. Despite numerous attempts at peace negotiations, a lasting solution has remained elusive. Efforts by international mediators and regional leaders have often been thwarted by deep-rooted suspicions and conflicting demands. The Oslo Accords of the 1990s, once hailed as a breakthrough, ultimately failed to bridge the deep divide. While they brought hope and a framework for peace, the Accords were unable to address the core issues that lay at the heart of the conflict. The collapse of the Camp David summit in 2000 and the subsequent Second Intifada further hardened positions on both sides. The violence and unrest that followed underscored the fragility of the peace process and the deep-seated frustrations of the Palestinian people. The failure to resolve the core issues of the conflict, borders, security, Jerusalem settlements and refugees, continues to fuel the cycle of violence and mistrust. These unresolved issues remain at the heart of the ongoing struggle, perpetuating a state of uncertainty and conflict. The current escalation is a stark reminder of the unresolved legacies of the past and the urgent need for a just and sustainable peace. As the world watches, the hope for a resolution lies in the willingness of both sides to engage in meaningful dialogue and compromise. The year 2023 marked a turning point in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, with a series of events pushing the region closer to the precipice of war. Political instability within Israel itself, marked by a series of elections and a shift towards right-wing nationalist ideologies, created a volatile domestic environment. The rise of extremist voices within Israeli politics advocating for annexation of Palestinian territories and curtailing Palestinian rights heightened tensions on the ground. Within the occupied West Bank, the expansion of Israeli settlements, considered illegal under international law, continued unabated, further squeezing Palestinian communities and fueling resentment. Simultaneously, Gaza, under the control of Hamas since 2007, remained mired in a humanitarian crisis exacerbated by the ongoing Israeli blockade and internal Palestinian divisions. Adding fuel to the fire was the increasing boldness of Hezbollah, the Iran-backed Shia militant group based in Lebanon. Empowered by its perceived victory against Israel in the 2006 Lebanon war and emboldened by Iran's growing regional influence, Hezbollah adopted a more assertive posture, increasing its military capabilities and rhetoric against Israel. By the end of 2023, the stage was set for a major conflagration. The convergence of political extremism in Israel, escalating tensions in the West Bank and Gaza, and Hezbollah's growing assertiveness created a tinderbox awaiting a spark. Section 4, 2024 on the precipice, war and its aftermath. The spark came in the form of a coordinated attack by Hamas on Israeli settlements near the Gaza border in the fall of 2023. This attack was meticulously planned and executed, catching the world by surprise. The attack, which caught Israeli forces off guard, marked a significant escalation in the conflict and triggered a swift and brutal Israeli response. The scale and intensity of the retaliation were unprecedented. Israel launched a full-scale military operation in Gaza, utilizing its air power, artillery and ground forces to target Hamas infrastructure and personnel. The skies over Gaza were filled with the roar of jets and the thunder of artillery. The fighting quickly spread to other fronts, creating a complex and volatile situation. Hezbollah, true to its warnings, launched rocket attacks on northern Israel from Lebanon, drawing Israel into a second front. The northern towns of Israel faced relentless rocket fire, adding to the chaos. Iran, while denying direct involvement in the initial Hamas attack, offered rhetorical support and reportedly supplied Hamas with advanced weaponry. This further complicated the geopolitical landscape. The international community, caught off guard by the speed and intensity of the conflict, scrambled to contain the situation. Emergency meetings were convened and urgent calls for peace were made. The United States, while reaffirming its unwavering support for Israel's right to defend itself, urged restraint and a return to diplomacy. High-level diplomatic efforts were launched to de-escalate the situation. Russia, using the crisis to assert its role as a power broker in the region, called for a ceasefire and offered to mediate between the warring parties. Moscow's involvement added another layer of complexity to the conflict. As the fighting raged on, the humanitarian cost of the conflict skyrocketed. The scenes of devastation were heart-wrenching. Civilian casualties mounted on both sides, with Gaza in particular bearing the brunt of the violence. The destruction was widespread and indiscriminate. Hospitals were overwhelmed, essential supplies dwindled, and the already fragile infrastructure crumbled under the weight of the bombardment. The humanitarian crisis deepened with each passing day. The conflict threatened to spill over into a wider regional war, with neighboring countries bracing for potential escalation. The entire region was on edge, fearing the worst. Section 5. The world reacts, a divided international response. The international community's response to the escalating conflict was swift but divided, reflecting the deep-seated political and ideological fault lines that have long characterized the Middle East quagmire. The reactions varied significantly, with some nations taking a hardline stance while others called for immediate de-escalation and peace talks. The United States, a staunch ally of Israel, found itself walking a tightrope, balancing its unwavering support for Israel's security with the need to prevent a wider regional conflagration. This delicate balancing act was evident in the diplomatic language used by US officials, who emphasized both support and caution. The Biden administration, while condemning the initial Hamas attack and reaffirming its commitment to Israel's right to defend itself, also called for restraint and urged Israel to minimize civilian casualties. President Biden's statements were carefully crafted to address both domestic and international audiences, aiming to maintain a semblance of neutrality. The US provided Israel with additional military aid, including precision-guided munitions and intelligence sharing, but also engaged in diplomatic efforts to broker a ceasefire. These efforts included high-level talks with regional allies and adversaries alike, showcasing the complexity of the US's role in the conflict. European countries, while largely sympathetic to Israel's security concerns, expressed growing unease over the high number of civilian casualties in Gaza and called for a proportionate response. Public opinion in Europe was increasingly critical of the violence, leading to widespread protests and calls for action. Several European nations, including France and Germany, proposed a UN Security Council resolution calling for a ceasefire and humanitarian access to Gaza. These proposals highlighted the European Union's desire to play a more active role in mediating the conflict and addressing the humanitarian crisis. Russia, eager to reassert its influence in the Middle East after years of US dominance, seized the opportunity to position itself as a mediator. The Kremlin's strategic moves were aimed at expanding its geopolitical footprint in the region. President Putin condemned the violence on both sides and called for a return to dialogue, offering to host peace talks in Moscow. This offer was part of Russia's broader strategy to present itself as a neutral arbiter in international conflicts. China, increasingly assertive on the global stage, echoed calls for restraint and a peaceful resolution, while also using the crisis to criticize US policy in the Middle East. Chinese officials highlighted what they described as the double standards of Western nations, further complicating the international response. The Arab world, deeply divided on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, struggled to forge a unified response. The internal divisions within the Arab League were stark, with member states unable to agree on a common course of action. Some countries, such as Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, which have recently normalized relations with Israel under the Abraham Accords, condemned Hamas's actions while urging restraint from Israel. These nations found themselves in a precarious position, balancing new diplomatic ties with long-standing regional loyalties. Others, like Turkey and Qatar, staunch supporters of Hamas, condemned Israel's military operation in Gaza and called for an end to the blockade. Their vocal opposition was accompanied by large-scale protests and diplomatic efforts to rally support against Israel's actions.